Idaho. Today we're going to talk with Violet Mary Norton Borrowman, my grandmother. I'm Jerry Borrowman. First of all, Grandma, when were you born?
November 8th, 1895.
1895, so that makes you 85 years old now.
That's right.
Okay, how long have you lived here in Pocatello?
4 years.
Okay, where were you born, Grandma?
I was born out from Idaho Falls, about 4 miles, on what they call a Sand Creek. My father, do you want this?
Sure, anything you want to say.
My father came to Idaho in 1883 and filed on a claim. In the spring of 1884, he went back to Lehigh, where he was born. My mother was born in Lehigh, Utah, also. And he came to Idaho and filed on his claim, as I have said. Then he went back to Lehigh, where his folks lived and where he had left my mother, and the rest of his family lived there. In 1884, they loaded up a covered wagon with some horses, sheep, pigs, chickens, and my mother had 2 children, a little boy and a little girl, who later, the girl died at 6 years old and my brother died at 19 years old.
How did your brother die?
My brother died of typhoid fever. My sister died from the results of scarlet fever, which was called dropsy. And I had 8 living brothers and two living brothers and 6 sisters remaining.
How many of your brothers and sisters are alive today, Grandma?
1 brother,
Who's that?
and my brother Reed, who is the youngest member of the family. He was born in 1903. I have 2 sisters, one who is older than I and one who is younger. The one older was born in 92. That's Etta, my sister Etta. She lives in Salinas, California. And my youngest sister was born in 1900, Effie.
And she lives in Salt Lake?
She lives in Salt Lake City.
Okay. Tell us about Idaho Falls back when you were growing up there.
Well, we lived, my father built a home, a log cabin, which we lived in first. However, they came to Idaho, and they arrived in Idaho along in the latter part of May. And so they lived in a covered wagon until my father could build a log cabin, which had just some planks laid over the roof, and it was covered with straw, or with weeds really, because there was no straw at that time. And then they put dirt over the top that kept out most of the rain, and the floor was a dirt floor. They lived there just a couple of years until they built a log house, a 2-room log house, which was fixed up nice on the inside. And they lived there for about 20 years, I think. But the year that they moved to Idaho Falls, my father was the first one in the valley to raise the first grain and to dig the first potatoes. When they left Salt Lake, or Lehigh, Utah, his father and mother said to him, "Rufus, you're just going to Idaho Falls to starve to death, because there just were very few people living there at that time, and all that was there was sagebrush and a few willows on the ditch banks, there were creek banks, and many Indians throughout the valley, especially around Blackfoot territory." And
Did you ever have trouble with the Indians?
Yes, when I was about 6 years old, I think, all through the time, from the time my father lived or came there, why, the Indians would go through the valley and they would always stop for something to eat. And they would always make quite a lot of noise, whooping and hollering, and they would always be painted up and have many colorful feathers. Now, we were taught as children that we must always feed these Indians or give them whatever they wanted. In that way, we would become friends to them rather than enemies. I remember one time when, quite a little girl, father and mother had gone to Idaho Falls, which took them about an hour to go to Idaho Falls from where we lived because they still were using a wagon and horses.
Now, how far would that have been?
That would have been about 5 miles. And of course the roads were dusty, there were no fences or anything this type, but just a dirt road. And so it took them quite a while to go. And so they left my oldest sister, Belle, who we called, her name was Isabel, but we called her Belle to take care of the rest of the family. Of course there were probably Rose and Effie younger than I who were still born. And I got awful frightened that day. I don't know why, but I did. And so I hid under the bed. But I peeked my head out from under the bed just in time to see my sister give him a big batch of bread, 8 big loaves, and it was piping hot, and it smelled so good. And as a little girl, I really didn't regret that. I thought, gee, we could have that for dinner. But anyway, she wrapped the bread up and gave it to these Indians. Now, we had many times that we had Indians visit us in this manner. Then they would go on up through Swan Valley and into the park. We also had many gypsies come through the valley, and they also frightened me. It seemed like they had a way that they would finagle around so that we always was frightened that they might take things or maybe steal one of we kids. So I remember one time one of these gypsies said to Mother, she wanted some money, and Mother said no, she didn't have any money. Now Mother kept for her change whatever we sold we'd sell the eggs and we'd sell butter, which Mother and we children would churn the butter, and Mother molded into molds, and we'd take it to town, and this would be her spending money. And she said no, she didn't have any money. But this gypsy somehow or other looked up at the cupboard and she said, you do have money, you have it in a pitcher in that cupboard. Now I suppose she was just really, guessing at it, thinking that's where Mother might keep her change, because she did have this money. And so Mother finally gave her the money and she went on. Well, later on, quite a bit later, we had a black mare, which we all just thought was the only animal on the farm, that we called Blanche. And Father had the Indians came, and Father somehow or other traded this Blanche off for a horse that the gypsies had. Well, naturally, we all set up a howl. And we felt so bad about old Blanche being taken away because she had been with us a long time on the farm. And one morning we got up and lo and behold, there was Blanche out in the corral. She'd gotten awfully thin and she was a black mare, a very pretty animal. And there she was, nibbling through the fence to get something to eat. Well, naturally, we all ran out, and part of us had a good cry about it. So when the Father let the gypsy know that she was back, but he told him that he would trade the horse back, but he would never let Blanche go. So naturally, she died on the farm.
She did.
In a later year, yes, she lived through this ordeal. But she had come about 20 miles all on her own to get to our home. which was very unusual. But we knew animals have a sense that they can get places that you'd be surprised how much intelligence they really have.
Okay, let's move up in time a little bit, grandmother. Tell us how you met Grandfather Borrowman. What you thought when you first saw him, and a little bit about your romance.
Well, when I first saw your grandfather, it was raining real hard on our farm, and my brother had gone to Idaho Falls. My father had died in the meantime, and my brother Bob had taken over running the farm that Mother owned. And so he went into Idaho Falls to see if he could hire help. And he hired this young man. Well, he was dressed up, this fellow was, and Bob, of course, was on the farm, so he had his work clothes on. When he got home, or when they did, it was raining real hard. And so my brother Bob took Linda and our horses off of the wagon and picked this fellow up and carried him in the house. And this didn't leave a very good impression on me. I thought, well, I sure don't like that guy. Well, he worked for my mother for about 4 years during the summer and the working season. And we got along. I used to think of this young man almost like I did my brother. And I remember one time I was going with a fellow, and my sister had come from California, and she said, you know, I think you're in love with that Lawrence. And I said, oh, don't be silly. He's just like a brother to me. I don't give him a second thought. However, when I wanted to go to a dance or something, if I didn't have a date with someone else, I'd go with him. Well, about 2 years later, I married that very guy.
So you knew him for 6 years, huh?
I knew him for 6 years.
Now, how old were both of you when you got married?
I was 21, and my husband was between 24 and 25.
Okay. Tell us about Grandfather through the years. What kind of a man was he?
Well, of course, I lived with him nearly 60 years, lacking 6 months. And naturally, I thought he was clear dope. He was an honest, upright man. However, when we were married, he smoked and he also drank occasionally. This I didn't like because I had always worked in the church all my life. I had been busy in our church. But I loved him so much that that didn't seem to matter. I guess I didn't think about the future. Maybe it would have done, but it didn't. And we were married in December the 23rd, 1916. And soon I became pregnant with my oldest son, Reed Park. And Morris said to me, well, I always went uptown and did the shopping and whatever we needed, and he needed some cigarettes, I thought, or some tobacco, which they used at that time. So I bought a can of Bull Durham, and I brought it home, and I said to him, I bought you some tobacco today. And he said, well, just please put it up on the pantry shelf, or take it back, whichever you see fit. And I kind of laughed, and I said, well, I'll put it up here, and maybe the flowers will get bugs in them, and I'll use it for that. And that's just what happened. He never took another cigarette. Well, I asked him why, and he said, I will never ask a child to do something that I can't do myself. And this is one thing that he stayed true to. He would never do anything that he didn't feel free to ask his children, his 2 sons and his daughter and his grandsons and daughters. He would never ask him to do something that he didn't see fit to do himself. And
Grandfather once told me, and I think it's been kind of a good story through the years, he said he gave up smoking. And he made the statement once that the habit of smoking cigarettes or tobacco was so strong that 40 years later, when he got nervous, he'd find himself reaching for a cigarette. Did he ever tell you that?
Yes, he did.
So it was quite an example that he was able to quit it and stay quit when it had such a powerful hold. Kate, tell us about your kids.
Well, our first son, Reed Park, was sure a special son. He's been a special son all through my life. We were so happy to get him. I remember that when he arrived, my husband was working for Utah Sugar Company, and he bought a box of cigars and took up to the factory to treat the fellows. And they said, well, Joe, how is it that you will treat all the rest of us and you don't take one? And he still said no, he had never taken a cigarette since the day he told me he had quit. Then Park was rather a shy little boy. He's a little boy, but he was very active. He was very easy to get along with, and a very lovable child, which he had made me proud so many, many times that he will never really know how proud I have been with having him. Then Merle came, and by the way, we had planned on a little girl, and we had chosen his name of Merle. And so that's how Merle got his name, is because we had planned on a girl, and that was sort of a girl's name, but he got named Merle L. Merle was a reserved fellow, more so than Reed. Reed was more friendly with his fellow associates than Merle was. Merle was quite a reserved fellow, a very studious fellow, and a very easy boy to get along with. Now Park and Merle, they were a little more temperamental, a little easier to become angry, but Merle didn't. He seemed to be, we never did see Merle get angry at any of us, although he did get angry, but he always went outside until he cooled off. However, after the boys became young men, one time they got into a pretty good fight, and I felt pretty bad about this. I couldn't ever see them fight. I'd always go between them. And this one time, their dad was at home. So he said, Mother, it's got to come to an end. They've got to have this out. And they're both grown enough, and enough the same size that they can have their fight. Well, they had their fight. And when I went out and walked around the yard while their dad sort of refereed it. When I came in, they both had a blooded nose, and they both had a black eye. First, I'd put a piece of beefsteak on one eye, and then on another. And of course, they survived that quite well. One of my uncles came down to see us one day, and he was with his daughter and her husband, and he looked at the boys, and I had told a lot of squibs of how the boys got those black eyes, because I just couldn't face the idea of my boys fighting and having a black eye. And this uncle said to me, well, don't feel bad, Violet. He said, I remember your dad and I had a good many fights, and that only helps them to become men. And I've thought that a lot of times.
Now tell us what, my dad is Reed. Tell us what Dad did through the years and what Merle did. Just kind of bring us up to date and then talk about Verla.
Well, I need to do a little thinking about this.
Okay, go on and tell us about Verla then, as a little girl.
Well, Verla was a very happy little girl. She was born on the run, and she always ran. What I mean, she beat the doctor to our home. And she was always very, very active, a very little girl, and she walked when she was 9 months old. One of our neighbors came in when she was about 10 months old. my husband sent her down on the floor, and he said, "For heaven's sake, don't tell me that baby's going to run, to walk." But she did. But at that time, she was small enough that she could walk under our table. And she had light curly hair, which I kept it in ringlets till she really outgrew that age. But she was always cheerful, always an energetic little person, and still is a very energetic person. Now let's see, to go back to read.
Well, maybe we better go on because of time.
Okay.
Do you remember getting the first car?
Yes, we got our first car in August of 1917. It was a Ford. And we had I had inherited just a little money, and that's it paid for this Ford. And I remember one night, well, this would have been quite a bit later than the first Ford, I presume. But anyway, this first Ford, we had to, in order to drive it uphill, we had to drive it up backwards, or the gas couldn't get to the ignition and keep it going. So every hill we got to, we turned the car around and back it up the hills.
Were there many cars around when you got your first one?
No, we were among some of the first ones around Sugar City to have a car. And we always had a car after then. And of course the boys learned to drive as soon as they were big enough to drive. At that time we didn't have to have a license of any kind, a driver's license, or so we just taught them how to drive, and they both drove, and they were both good drivers.
Okay. Grandmother, you've got 3 children, then you've got Reed, Merle, and Verla, who've grown to adulthood. Dad stayed in this area. He's worked many years in the automotive parts business, an educated man, and today he's active in the church and in the bishopric. Merle went on and graduated from Columbia University, as I understand, taught for many years at Madison, Wisconsin in English, and today he's teaching at the University of California at Berkeley. For many years he served as Dean of the School of Education, and Verlin then settled in Salt Lake, where they ran their own business for many years, a collection agency. Is that right?
That's right.
Now, how many grandchildren do you have? And
Well, I have 12 grandchildren, and I really don't know how many great-grandchildren right now.
quite a few, huh? Do you like your great-grandchildren?
They're, every one of them, especially the ones that I know best, which are Norman's 2 children. That's my oldest granddaughter from my daughter. I know them real well. And Gerald's 3, and little Scott seemed like to me that he, from the day he was born, he seemed to love me even before he knew me. And the other, little Jeff, is following in his path. So I really idolize those children. And I'm sure if I were so, I could be closer to the other grandchildren, they would rate just the same, because I'm sure I love them all truly as much, only that you have to know people to really learn to love every character that they have.
What does Scott call you? That's kind of interesting. What did he first start calling you?
Tell me. Great, and that is a unique way, and that also reminds me of his uncle Keith. He started to calling me Da. Now I don't know why either one of them chose the names they did, but going back to Keith, he called me Da until the boys and the kids started making fun of him in school, which he changed to call me Grandma, and so did his brothers called me Da for a long time.
Okay. Do you remember when the Idaho Falls Temple was dedicated?
It was dedicated in 1917. 1940. I don't just recall the day that it was dedicated, but it was in 1940.
Did you attend the services or?
Yes, I attended the services, and so did my mother. She was in Idaho Falls visiting with us at the time Idaho Falls temple was dedicated. And prior to it being erected, they put on what they called, I guess I have forgotten what they called it, but anyway, they put on a play depicting the early pioneers who settled in Idaho, which brings back to my mother, because when it was dedicated, President his name?
Grant?
No.
George Albert Smith?
President Wilford Woodruff was asked by, now Rexburg was settled before Idaho Falls was, and it had a board before Idaho Falls did. And a fellow by the name of Thomas Ricks was the president of that state. So he asked the president, he was the president of the church this time, come and gather up enough saints to organize a stake. And so he was sent to Idaho Falls with President Grant, who was later President Grant. And President Grant, by the way, is the same age as my mother. And they had the services on my father's ranch. I don't recall how many people were there, perhaps about 40. And I remember in the middle of the speech, the president stopped his speech and he said, we're going to hold the services up a few minutes because the cows are out and they're in the grain field. And we mustn't let any wheat go to waste because we might need it in this open country. So they did that. Well, afterward, my mother served their dinner on the end gate of a wagon box. Now you maybe won't know what an end gate is, but that will be something for you to find out.
Okay.
But anyway, that was quite an event in our life, and there was a monument erected for this, which was later torn down by some vandalism, and there's just a fence and a bunch of rocks remaining at this time.
Okay. Grandmother, if you were to say anything to your posterity, this tape will last for many, many years. What would you say to them?
I would say to be faithful to the church, and to, if you haven't studied it enough to understand it, to be thoroughly convinced, study and get an insight and to know why you are a Mormon. Secondly, I would say that I want all of you to be proud of the Borrowman name. It's a name to be proud of, a name to carry on in honesty and uprightness, and be faithful and do the things that you promise to do. I think for one thing, be sure that you stay what you promise to do, that you do that thing, or have a real excuse why you're not doing it. Because anything that I don't like is dishonesty in any way, in any word we speak, or anything we do. And I would like all of you to remember this, that this is what I want most of all, is to have every child in my family, no matter how many generations they pass, that you will be honest, upright men and women.
Okay, there's one last thing I'd like you to tell these people that you told me when I got married. And that was something, your piece of advice to having a good marriage. Do you remember what that was? Whenever a person had to travel?
I don't remember.
Okay, you told me that the one thing that Grandfather Borrowman always did is that he'd take you wherever he went.
Yes, he said that he married me because he loved me, and he married me because he wanted to be with me. He didn't marry me to leave me home while he went anywhere else. And no matter what, if it was humanly possible, I always went with him. He said, work can keep, other things can happen, but our love for each other and our friendship means more than all else.
And with that, we'll close this tape. Thanks so much.